hear it. How's it going?
Good. Hey, Justice. I'm not Justice, but I am Nathan Erznosnik, and
I'm Justice Daniels, and this is DriveWorks 360.
DriveWorks 360. Looking to just talk a little bit, kind of podcast, video cast series here, Justice. And you asked me, did I have a topic?
Yeah. Kind of
And I
what's
do.
the thoughts for today?
Got a little bit of a story, and this is a little bit personally today. Went out to lunch with my mom, and it's a little bit about mindset, and it's about finding wins in our life.
Interesting.
And what that might mean for us. And so I'm going to tell you this brief story, then I want to ask you a question to see. Well, let me just ask you this. I'm going to keep everybody on hold because the story, it was pretty good.
Okay.
And maybe it started my mom. I called her yesterday, took the day off, was looking at doing several things. What's not in the yard, dog fences, snow just finally melted here. Wanting to work on some ThriveWork 360 things. Called my mom, said, I was going to go to lunch. She was already at lunch. It was a late lunch, I guess. It was breakfast, like 10:30. I had got the haircut, amongst other things. And she's like, hey, I'd love to go tomorrow. So this will be about my conversation tomorrow. So I'm going to come back to this shortly. But let me ask you this, Justice. As in the world, I think that one of the biggest challenges that people have, and I'm going to use this, is going to be talking about mindset. So I'm going to ask you a question about mindset and see how we might find a small win for those that are with us today. And I would have to say that what we see or what we believe in our mind and maybe what we see in our mind is either opening the door to anything that's possible, or it closes it and it shuts it off. And so I wanted to ask you this really quick is where are you today in what you see? And I'm going to say this maybe from two things, something that causes or is stopping you from creating tremendous success. So there's the stop. And then tell and share with me what might be something that you're starting to believe that you think will create and build your future.
I think that's an interesting one because for me, one of the things I think of is like, what do I start to see? Well, I could kind of see limitless possibilities, right? And I think that's great. And I think most people can do it, like be a dreamer, But for me, where it gets hard is I'm a big believer in humility, but sometimes I let humility be an excuse, and it's kind of like that perfect conditions excuse of when I'm trying to push, that it's like, I got to not congratulate myself occasionally. So it's like, okay, you're not doing good. I guess where I'm going with this is sometimes I'll just get bogged down, and then like you beat yourself up so much, it stops you from moving forward. So like you're no longer happy about the success you're creating, right? I don't know if this is making sense where I'm going.
It could. Have you, or how often might you say that happens? How often are you like, oh, the world's my oyster, and then
Reality
30 minutes, it's the evening. Is it a day? Is it a week? Because I understand what you're saying. You're like, hey, I believe, and I had these thoughts, right? Like, I'm going to be able to do this. But then you're like, man, I shouldn't, or maybe I'm not.
And you start working through it, and it gets a little bit harder, right? And then you keep pushing. I would say that's about like a 2-week period usually, I notice. And it's like, okay, I need, and I guess this is where the humility comes in. I need to allow myself to rest a little and then get back at it, right? Like to prevent that burnout. And so that's where I'd say it's like a couple week transition time on what that is for me.
Gotcha. So a couple week transition time. So going back to that, again, what you're saying is you can get yourself motivated.
Yep.
The world has unlimited potentials. And do you really think that, or are you only finding partial potentials? And I'm going to say this because the thing that I'm going to talk about here in a minute, I'm going to bring up, I think that we actually don't know what we can do.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm going to say that there are a few people that do. I think a few people think that the world has the resources we need to do whatever we believe we set our mind to. And I'm going to say that might be people, it might be, our output on energy. It might be connecting with others. It might be, finding the minerals in the world that we need to bring together. I think there's like variations, but again, so being honest, like take your last week, and I'm going to ask you to two things. We're going to kind of talk about this, and I'm going to move into the story about my mom here. What stopped you from what last week? And I'm going to give you a minute to dwell on this. What last week? Okay, if you were to score your last week in total output, what are you going to do? On a scale of 0 to 10, last week you were X in efficiency, or you accomplished X in what you might have wanted, or X. Like, what was last week's output to you? Where were you?
Last week was rough because I think that was on one of those downward sides. I think last week was like a 6. I'm going to say that's just from some secular stuff too, right? Not necessarily just with the work, but I'm kind of gauging that total life, right? Like, what am I doing to grow? Because I'm a firm believer, like, you can show up, do a great job at work, but what are you doing to enhance that outside of work? Because I don't think work is just enough, right? Even if you're growing for work, what am I doing with my education, with the books I'm reading, with even physical health? Am I
Love
getting out
this.
and doing that, right? Is
Great.
there the spiritual side to it if that's what you're into? And so I think it gets hard. And so I guess that was that kind of arc I was talking about is, so last week
Okay,
was a
so
6.
6. So then let me ask you this. What identify one item that you think made it a 6? Just one.
School. So
Okay.
trying to finish up a degree.
Okay. Trying to finish the degree. Now, here's what I'm going to do. Let me ask you, what was it that you actually learned last week about, or what was something, or how did you move forward last week in school? Give me the win.
I started finding ways because I was having a hard time because I'm at a barrier. I need to take a test, right? And it's in this financing course. And so what I found as a win is I started finding other ways to consume. So I was like, oh, I need to get through this book. And I was like, really, I need to just practice, right? But I was like, between work and some other stuff going on, I was like, oh, I'm not, not motivated. It's like 7:30 at night. And I'm like, oh man. And so I was like, let me find some videos about these topics. And I was like, and I'm just going to walk the dog. I'm going to do a run, and I'm going to put this in and listen to it. And so that was where it was like, okay, I'm going to find these other wins to not beat myself up, right? Which was that humility piece. And humility is a weird word, but you start going like, oh, you're just not good enough. You're never going to be there. You can't do anything. So it kind of is like when you're like, oh, do you really believe those things? It's like, I believe I could do anything, but definitely have to re-pump myself
So
up
again,
for
thinking
that.
about just this last week again, I want to. The reason I want to bring this back is I want to see if we can turn this around.
Okay.
You said it was difficult, but you said you started to define different ways of consuming. I'm guessing ways of faster
engaging.
learning.
Yeah.
So what was it that you put in place? Did you feel like you learned faster? Did you find something that started to accomplish that because you started breaking it down?
Yeah, I felt like I was starting to get this other information I was lacking from not doing that.
And again, maybe this is good as a clarity. Did you do some things by separating your mind to go do some exercise? Like, what was it again? Give me the small list of what you did to help consume the information faster. And then I'm curious to know, last week from 3 weeks ago, if you were to rate the ability 3 weeks ago to last week, where are you in your ability to consume?
Oh, I get what you're saying. So like actually digesting the information.
Whatever you're
versus
telling me.
just
Like right
sitting
now, you
there.
said, again, I was at a 6. I'm like, okay, tell me what was at a 6. And then I said, tell me what was a win. So we kind of moved that to
Yeah.
a side. I said, and you said, like, I think that I started breaking down how I could start to learn the
Right.
information, which it sounds like if that was the case that you didn't do that 3 weeks ago. So what
Mm.
I'm looking for is a comparison between 3 weeks and last week. So what was the win last week, or what were the wins regarding that specifically, so the audience could hear where you were
Gotcha.
3 weeks and where you were last week?
Gotcha. So 3 weeks ago, I think it was much more excuse based, right? Building some excuses around what it was. And then also being like, oh, I was pretty set in stone, like, this is the only way I'm going to learn and progress towards this end goal through this book, right? So then I guess to where I'm at now is kind of a shift in that mindset of looking at, I can do that, and it doesn't have to look like this one thing I thought it looked like before, right? And so I feel like I am digesting, am consuming a little bit better because I'm
You
connecting
changed the
more
expectation
ways,
on what the output
right?
kind of
Like,
was
or
and what
how
you're
I
working
had to
towards.
get there, right? And
Oh,
so
I
all
like
of a
that.
sudden it felt doable. I was like, oh, this feels doable now, right? And like it's the same course, it's the same test I have to take, it's the same knowledge I need to take. But how I started going about doing that opened it up to where I feel like I'm just getting through it, right? And then I think it was a slight piece of motivation. So I find that when I get a little bit more motivated, I attack it a little bit more aggressively
Love
and start
that.
moving through it a little better and easier.
So now let me ask you this.
Yeah.
If you were to consider that one element
Mm.
on a scale of 1 to 10, what was that element last week?
Last week, I would say that was like an 8, right? Like doing that felt way better once I started doing that.
Okay. And I just wanted to focus on this because we'll come back, and I've been learning quite a bit. I've been reading a whole lot of things. there's a lot of ways of finding wins in our day. Some of that's hearing and learning from others. Some of it's the material
Yeah.
we consume. Some of it's thinking and changing the way in which we perceive something.
Right.
And so I wanted to think about this win, because if you're going to take a look at what you're doing and what your last week was, and some of
Right.
you that might be very overwhelming, then I might say, hey, how was yesterday? How was today? And I'm going to talk a little bit about this, just as we talked about in ThriveWorks 360. One of the things we're going to look to do is kind of share, and my wife was talking about this today, is kind of doing more of a deep dive on part of a book and a topic. One thing that I'm reading is by Dan Sullivan. It's The Gap and the Gain.
Oh, okay.
And it's a really interesting concept. And so it talks about, and I don't want to try to summarize all this, but when we start to really look at and we search for gains, we actually find that they're eights, they're nines, they're sevens, they're not sixes, they're not fives, because when we look at the whole of what we do, we tend to look at ourselves and we put ourselves, what he calls, in the gap. We put ourselves in the space of what I'm not doing, or what else I need to be doing, or boy, it sure could be done better.
That's interesting.
If we flip that to, well, what did you do that helped enhance? And when I took you back 3 weeks, when I took you back to this week,
Right.
and the other thing he talks about, again, we don't want to go into details. It goes back into, we can really, and I love what he says, and you're going to question this. He says, like, every time you go back to your past, you're telling yourselves a story, because you're reliving, and you can change that. It's like, I always like to say, the first fish that somebody caught was this big, and it kind of grows every time they tell the story, right? Because you rewrite that story. But he said, like, well, you can't do that. People talk to him. You can't rewrite it. He says, I sure can. It's my life, and it was what I saw or how I felt about it.
Yeah.
And you can absolutely change that. So to me, if I were to ask you again, how do you feel now that I lightly explained that and you thought about the win at an 8? Does that make last week feel like the gain was better than what you thought you maybe didn't do by looking at the gaps, or how not good last week might have been?
Absolutely. And it helps me feel like I can get through the course, kind of, right? Because that's one of the things you're thinking about, is like, oh, how am I going to connect this, right? And in my mind, like, that's sort of like start going, how do I start actually, I don't know, accomplishing these goals I have? It makes it a lot more chunkable. Yeah, absolutely. I think
So
that's great.
I just wanted to kind of share that. So
That's
this
awesome.
has been in my mind. I've been building on this, and I started thinking there's things that he talks about that are very powerful in the evening time, the morning time. So today I was just thinking too, because I've been listening to this. I think about this all the time. So here's my story about my mom.
Yeah.
And so I asked her out, and I'm in this interesting place where I'm a very direct person. Like, I don't beat around the bush, or if I ask somebody something, what I ask is literally face value for what that is. And that's been my entire life. And so some people say I'm intense because of that. And I was like, hey, where would you like to go? And I know that she's in a position where she is accommodating a lot of people in her life. And I don't feel like she needs to accommodate me. In fact, I want to accommodate her. And today she kind of mentioned that's unique for somebody to feel like they're accommodating her. But I was talking to her a little bit about this today, because I said, hey, just so you know, I wanted to share a little bit about where I'm at. And I want you to think about this. And it came back to having her and allowing her that when she talks to me, instead of thinking about the worries or the concerns or what she needs to do, I said, hey, if I'm reaching out, what is the plus of what you think we might be able to gain by spending the time together? If I'm going to say, hey, let's go to lunch, I call her Nana, instead of thinking about, oh, I'm wondering if this is going to inconvenience him, or I wonder what this cost is. I told her, when I reach out, and again, this doesn't work for everybody. I said, hey, if I'm reaching out, then the thought and the plan that I have is, if I'm opening the door, that the door is as wide open as shoot. I want, in essence, that you can do, Nana, you can take this. And really, I would say that any place that you want to go, as an example, and to eat, to any kind of a food that you want to do is on the table. Because otherwise I would say, hey, Nana, I feel like I'd like to go to somewhere for fast food. Like I would clarify that.
Set some
And so I was
parameters.
really just talking to her about having her open her mind to see the gains or the wins that she might have when I reach out to her, versus worrying about the things that surround it in which her life normally has. And again, that's not easy. And I don't think next time it'll change for her. But I think that it was interesting for me to have the conversation, because I first said, hey, I want to talk to you about a couple of things. She got a little bit worried because now Nathan's getting serious. I said, no,
Oh,
I just care about you, and I care about what I'm wanting these experiences to be. And so I said, hey, next time I would ask for you to maybe be a little curious with me if I'm calling up and asking you, and just know also that I'm a pretty face value guy. She knows this, but her life has been so much for accommodating others. I'm like, hey, I want to help accommodate you. So I'll let you know. And next time, I don't want you to worry about that. I can kind of let you know, hey, there
Right.
might be limits, there might be not. The time was the other one, like, oh, I'm not quite sure. I said, hey, my day was very flexible. I was doing a bunch of things, had a bunch of stops, but I would have said, and I told her this, I said, hey, really, I'd like to do lunch between 1 and 2. Are you available? That's
Right.
different than me saying, hey, Nana, how was your day looking? Because now I'm saying for me, I'm going to open up my schedule to accommodate you.
Whatever. Yeah.
And she's not used to this, right? So I always feel it puts me in this weird spot that I'm trying to define and let her know that if we go somewhere that she wants to eat, that it's not going to be putting me out of my pocket, that it's not going to be inconveniencing my
Right.
day. And so again, that kind of is what he refers to as this gap.
Yeah.
She's in this space that instead of looking at the things that are the pluses or what could be had or what might be the potential, it's a difficult thing for us. And I think
Yeah.
all of us do this. I do it all the time.
Definitely do
And
it.
I know there's several stories, and I was listening to a couple other individuals that have put together some great mentorship on helping people do and find what they love. And one of the things they just talk about is kind of, we can share your thoughts on this
Yeah.
that I'd like to get, but we actually don't dream big enough. We don't believe enough is possible. We don't believe we can accomplish some of the most greatest things that we would want to, because we can only see so far, right?
Mm.
And that it is almost one of those that if we look beyond that, then we might be lying to ourselves. And that's
Yeah.
one of those things where you said, I don't really know, and there's these concerns, or can I? And then we actually get into that space, which
Make
is
it
the
possible.
gap,
Yeah. Oh.
if we think about it. So then the gain would be is what could I or what might I do today? And it's not everything. But going back, there's a lot of other concepts around, so I don't want to get into it. But coming back to that, what are your thoughts that you have kind of surrounding what that might mean in the power of our mind and or the restrictions, and then being in the place that is not looking at wins or the losses?
Mm.
And then I'll finish this up with a couple of last thoughts on 2 words to think about as we're doing this.
All
But
right. Yeah. No, I think it's interesting because in my mind, I'm like trying to think about all the scenarios that I've found in my life where maybe that can apply to it. And
man, that's a good question.
I won't call it excuses, but I go like, oh, I've never thought it in that framework, right? But even with working with different teams or businesses or where it's at, trying to set growth goals. Let's say there's a certain revenue we want to hit, or let's say there's some objectives we have. One of the first things you'll always hear, and it's disguised as like, oh, I'm just trying to help build up so we know what we're getting into, is everything that's going to stop it from happening, right?
Oh,
Which is
that's
interesting because it's
interesting.
like, oh, and I know it's different because then for her it's accommodating, but for other things it's like, and I did this, so I have a few instances in my life, I don't have to share them all, where it's like, actually it's that fear of failure, right? Like it's
little
there's
bit, yeah.
some fear
Something
of
comes in.
failure
Yep.
that comes in, and with personal relationships, maybe it's the failure of like, oh, well, I'm not giving enough, and this is the way I give, right? Maybe for her it's the way she gives, and she feels like she can be a value add. But I think that's very interesting because I create those barriers, and I think we have more of those in different ways than we think. But that's a great
Yeah.
concept.
So here's the one of the things that I had in my mind, and again, this is talked about in a few different books, and this relates to people we know. This relates to our day. It relates to, you said, several different factors. It might be spiritual, physical.
Right.
It might be with work. It might be with health. There's just so many different things, relationships. And I just maybe challenge this. And if you think about any period of time, whether that's the day, whether it's the week, whether it's the month, if you were to go back, and I talk about this and I decide, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to be changing the way I poise this, because people say that, oh, I want to, how fast can we fail?
Yeah.
And people are saying, well, it actually is never a failure if you learn. So then you can actually replace how fast do I fail with how fast do I learn? Because they're actually the same thing if you look at it as a forward moving piece.
Right.
So I liked that. And the thought is what did I learn? And if I took you back to your week again, and I would ask you, what did you learn? You're like, well, last week I did these things that put together the way I was perceiving my way of consumption of learning, and you changed it, and now it was better. So there's these learnings. And then you can also say, well, actually, because of that, here's what I got on my test. You can look and also say that these were maybe the gains that I had. So I'll go back to my mom, kind of finishing up, is my conversations with her. I hope and I believe that next time we connect and I do something, whether it's meeting her at her home or connecting together at a specific time for dinner, for lunch, or on the phone, is, I think now that I've had the conversation, I can say, hey, what is there to learn, and what might we gain from this, Nana?
Right.
Let's look at this from the gain perspective. And I believe that the relationship will continue to build and flourish even better and faster, because we're not putting things in front of it that slow that down or change it or take away from that.
Yeah.
And I maybe just share, those are my couple last thoughts I had. I think they're very powerful. I'm on this journey and I'm going to continue to learn how
Yeah.
I do this more. And I'd love to share that with you. But any last
I think
thoughts you'd
that's
have on that,
awesome.
Justice, on what you've thought about now, kind of bringing that
Yeah,
today?
no, I think that's kind of an explanation of the cycle. One of the thoughts I have is like, oh, how do you put yourself in a frame of mind, right? Because we
It's a good
talk about a few
question.
different things like, oh, I put myself in a box, and so I find I'm in these parameters for talking, or, I start doing that. So I would just be curious on how do we look at getting to where we start changing that light?
Good.
Because it's not an easy thing to be in
Nope.
there,
Yep.
right? And that's where I almost talk about those cycles and it's kind of a bad thing, but I think it's reality is like at some point you have to like start recognizing, and then I find that when I recognize, I build a little bit more momentum, and then I'm able to
I like
keep
that. Yep.
going and then keep applying. And then maybe, because I think of it as training. Like I think of everything like personal development, all of what it is this training on who we are. And so, for the next 2 weeks, it might be that I'm 50% successful in doing that. And then like the month after that, I'm 60%. And the month after that,
Yeah.
and incrementally, I'm
Yeah.
applying more and more, and not letting that be another barrier. Like, oh, I wasn't good at that this week, so
Oh, see, the
now
question I
I
would say is,
can't do it,
yeah,
right? It's like,
and
no,
yeah,
I wasn't good, but next week I can do this to be
or it
better
would be,
maybe.
was there
And
something
that's
that you learned?
exciting.
If you said I wasn't good,
Right.
the other thing you could say is maybe it wasn't, but is there something you learned that you would not do again?
Mm,
Or that you would change. And so I go back to that.
right.
And so I love what that is. Maybe we'll throw this out there. Leave this in comments,
Yeah,
share your
absolutely.
thoughts on what that might be. How might you look at finding a win or finding a lesson? Again, you might say, hey, I didn't do as well. Maybe you might consider that a failure. Then you can say, well, if I didn't, how would I do that again? And if I
Mm,
did, what might I do to make it better or make it a win? And
yeah,
I think those are some really good things. So put those in the
that's
comments.
awesome.
I think this goes all over the place. I believe very much so, and I don't think I still fully understand because, Justice, this is part of our journey, and this is the journey that we have with several the entrepreneurs and different business owners out there and individuals in your own life. Um, I think there's tremendous opportunities. I know our minds,
Absolutely.
and if we're around the right people and we think the right way, I just think we're
Mm,
limitless. I think there's untapped potential in every single one of us. So that's my last little bit
that's
that I thought
awesome.
I'd share.
I appreciate that.
Good
That was a great
bit to
story.
learn myself. I thought about you quite a bit in the same thing, and I know I've thought about myself. I'm like, hey,
Yeah,
how do we do a little bit more on this? That was my
I
topic
think
today.
that's
Again,
great.
I would say like, share, and subscribe. We would love to have you
Yeah,
share and hopefully come back for more as we continue to build out and share our little nuggets of wisdom, and hopefully you can
it's
apply them
awesome.
in your life and find that you can move forward in your trajectory. Part of our goal with Thrive Works 360 is to help impact, over 100,000 different businesses and individuals with finding success in those things that they're searching for. Um, Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks,
Appreciate it.
everyone. Have a great day.
Look forward, and we'll see you shortly and soon.
Liked it.